On the night of September 14, 2011, 19-year-old college student Emily Grace Walker finished her shift at a small diner in Cookeville, Tennessee. She walked into the parking lot just before midnight. A witness saw her standing near a green Ford pickup truck under a dim streetlight. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. The next morning, Emily's family reported her missing. Police began searching immediately. Her phone sent a final signal along the I-40 highway, then went silent. There was no sign of struggle in the parking lot. No car, no belongings left behind. For weeks, officers combed fields, lakes, and wooded areas. Flyers went up across town. Friends and volunteers joined in. Every lead faded. The case went cold. Months later, a breakthrough seemed possible. Emily's red jacket was found near Center Hill Lake. On it, investigators collected male DNA. But the profile did not match anyone in the system. Without a suspect, the trail stalled again. One man, James Dalton, was questioned but cleared when his alibi held. The case returned to silence. Years passed. Her family kept pushing. Vigils were held. The story remained alive. But answers never came. Then in 2020, almost a decade later, hikers discovered human remains in the woods near the lake. Forensic testing confirmed what everyone had feared. Emily had been there the entire time. The manner of death suggested she had not vanished by choice. With new technology, investigators revisited the DNA from her jacket. This time, advanced genetic genealogy traced it to a local man named David Ross. He had once joined the search for Emily, standing side by side with volunteers. But behind that image was the truth. Police gathered more evidence, including data from his phone records and items found at his home. In July 2021, he was arrested. By early 2022, the case finally reached a courtroom. DNA, cell data, and witness testimony painted a complete picture. The jury delivered a guilty verdict. After 10 years, the disappearance that haunted Cookeville was resolved. Justice had arrived. If you want to know how investigators pieced together every fragment of evidence, from the parking lot that night to the final moments inside the courtroom, stay with us. In the next part, we'll trace the step-by-step timeline of Emily's disappearance, the first suspects, and how a red jacket by the lake became the turning point in a decade-long search for answers. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts below. Your engagement helps keep these cold cases alive. Emily Grace Walker was 19 years old in 2011. She was in her second year at Tennessee Tech University, studying nursing. Cookeville was her hometown. She had lived there all her life, and the small college town shaped her routine. Friends knew her as dependable, focused, and grounded. She came from a middle-class family. Her parents worked steady jobs in the area and raised their 2 daughters with modest means. Emily was the oldest, and her younger sister was 15 at the time she vanished. They were close, and despite her college workload, Emily made time to visit home on weekends. She lived in a dormitory near campus, surrounded by other students, but home was always just a short drive away. Like many students, she needed extra income. Emily worked part-time at Jefferson A local diner popular with both students and townspeople. She usually covered evening shifts, which ended around 11 at night. Her managers described her as punctual and trustworthy. She showed up on time, closed her station carefully, and rarely asked for days off. To the people who worked with her, she was reliable. Someone who could be counted on when things got busy. Her daily routine was simple. Classes during the day, shifts at the diner in the evening. study sessions at the library with a small group of close friends. Some evenings were spent at campus events, but most nights followed a steady pattern. She also kept a habit of writing notes in a small journal and often took photos with a basic camera, capturing moments with friends, the campus, and her family. These small details built a picture of stability. As the fall semester moved forward, Emily's schedule became even more structured. She was preparing for midterm exams. She kept her work. Her plans for the future were clear. She wanted to finish her nursing degree and work in healthcare. She had already begun to explore internship opportunities and had spoken to her professors about career paths. Her family later told investigators she had been excited about the upcoming semester and had talked about moving into an apartment with friends once she turned 20. The night she disappeared, she left Jefferson A after closing her shift. Nothing in her routine suggested danger. She locked up her workspace, waved goodbye to a coworker, and walked toward the parking lot. What happened next would erase the ordinary path of her life. Her disappearance was not just a tragedy for her family, but the beginning of a cold case that would stretch nearly a decade. Every small detail of her background became important to investigators. Her habits, her schedule, her contacts, and her movements. Detectives pieced together how normal her life had been in the days leading up to September 14th. That clarity only deepened the mystery. The case file shows that Emily's background contained no obvious risk factors. She did not use drugs. She had no criminal history. She had a supportive family and stable friends. This profile made her sudden disappearance all the more alarming to police. For investigators, the lack of warning signs meant the answer had to lie outside her normal circle. Someone else had stepped into her path. Her family's role in keeping her memory alive was critical. From the very first morning after she was reported missing, her parents spoke publicly. They refused to let the case fade. They organized searches, spoke with reporters, and worked with law enforcement. Her younger sister, still in high school, became a visible figure at vigils and awareness events. This steady pressure ensured that even as the years passed, Emily's name did not disappear from public view. When the case grew cold, her background became the baseline investigators returned to again and again. They asked the same questions. Who saw her last? Who worked with her at the diner? Who lived near the parking lot? Her daily routine provided the timeline that detectives tried to map against cell phone data, eyewitness accounts, and later forensic evidence. This focus on her ordinary life also served another purpose. It eliminated distractions. Investigators could rule out the possibility that she had left voluntarily, or that she had planned her own disappearance. Every trace pointed back to the same conclusion. She had gone to work, finished her shift, and was heading home. Then, somewhere between the diner and the last cell tower ping on I-40, she vanished. Emily Grace Walker's disappearance would ultimately reveal the limits of traditional investigation and the power of new forensic science. But before DNA breakthroughs and courtroom verdicts, there was the life of a 19-year-old student whose ordinary evening ended in silence. Her world looked steady, safe, and routine. Yet on September 14th, all of it stopped. In the next part, we will follow the final hours of that night, the closing shift at Jefferson A, the empty parking lot, the green Ford pickup, and the last phone signal on Interstate 40. On September 14, 2011, Emily Grace Walker worked the late shift at Jefferson A, a small diner on the edge of Cookeville, Tennessee. It was a Wednesday night. The weather was unsettled, a light rain passing through the town, but nothing unusual enough to change her routine. She showed up on time, covered her tables, and carried out her closing duties as she always did. The shift ended around 11 o'clock. Co-workers later told investigators that Emily seemed completely normal. She wasn't tired, she wasn't upset, and she wasn't in a hurry. She signed out, collected her things, and walked toward the parking lot. Security footage from inside the diner confirmed the exact time she left. Everything matched the statements given by the staff who saw her that night. The parking lot behind the diner was nearly empty by the time Emily walked outside. Only a few cars remained. The rain had stopped, but the pavement was still wet. A single streetlight cast a weak glow over the asphalt. A witness driving past reported seeing Emily near a green Ford pickup truck. The description was vague. The witness could not say if she was speaking to someone or simply standing nearby. The lighting was poor, and the sighting lasted only seconds. No one else saw her after that moment. No shouts were heard, no calls for help, no noise that would have drawn attention. In less than a minute, Emily was gone from public view. That image, one young woman, a nearly empty lot, and a green truck under a dim light, was the last confirmed sighting before she vanished. Investigators traced. Cookeville police treated the case as urgent. Within the first 12 hours, they opened a formal missing person file and began their search. Officers visited Jefferson A, secured the parking lot, and looked for evidence. They examined the area carefully. There was no blood, no obvious signs of a struggle, no dropped personal items. Her car was gone as well, leaving investigators with almost nothing to start with. Nearby cameras offered little help. One convenience store camera faced part of the road, but was too far away to capture details. A grainy image of a vehicle resembling a pickup truck appeared on the recording, but the quality was too poor to identify a license plate. That footage became one of the earliest, but weakest pieces of evidence in the file. Detectives began questioning everyone connected to Emily. Co-workers confirmed she left as usual. Friends confirmed she had made no unusual plans that evening. Family members explained she had no reason to leave town or vanish on her own. No arguments, no debts, no hidden troubles. Her disappearance made no sense against the backdrop of her steady life. The lack of evidence forced police to widen their search quickly. Teams of officers and volunteers began combing through wooded areas near the diner. Helicopters scanned fields and creeks. Search dogs were deployed along the roads leading to Interstate 40. Nothing was found. The area was too large, and the trail was already fading. The emotional impact on the town was immediate. Cookeville was a small community. A missing 19-year-old student was not something people could ignore. News outlets picked up the story within hours. By the evening of September 15th, local television carried Emily's photograph and urged anyone with information to call the police tip line. Volunteers responded in large numbers. Residents printed flyers with her picture. They canvassed neighborhoods, taped posters to gas stations, and handed them out at intersections. Search groups gathered daily. People walked along country roads, checked abandoned barns, and scanned the shoreline of Center Hill Lake. Despite the effort, there was no breakthrough. Detectives focused on the most obvious lead, the green Ford pickup truck. Officers cross-referenced vehicle registrations, searched for local owners, and interviewed anyone who drove a truck matching that. Emily's family remained visible throughout those early days. Her parents spoke at press conferences, urging anyone with information to step forward. Her younger sister appeared with them, holding search posters, often in tears. The family home filled with volunteers, maps, and phone calls. For them, the hours were unbearable. For the investigators, the silence was just as frustrating. Within 2 weeks, the case became one of the most closely followed investigations in Cookeville. Still, nothing concrete appeared. Witness statements contradicted each other. Some people thought they saw a similar truck on I-40 that night. Others believed they spotted Emily near a gas station, but none of those tips checked out. Police continued to treat the disappearance as suspicious. Statistically, a young woman walking alone late at night, last seen near an unidentified vehicle, with her phone going silent within an hour, was unlikely to be voluntary. But suspicion alone could not move the case forward. Without physical evidence, without a body, and without a suspect, investigators had little to build on. In the weeks that followed, the absence of answers weighed heavily on the town. The diner where Emily had worked remained open, but her co-workers described the atmosphere as tense. Customers asked about her constantly. Flyers with her photograph stayed taped to windows and utility poles long after the initial search slowed down. By the end of that first month, the case stood at a standstill. Every avenue had been checked: the parking lot, the road, the phone records, the co-workers, the family. Each line of inquiry confirmed the same facts, but failed to uncover the next step. Emily had walked out of her workplace. She had reached the lot. She had been seen near a green Ford pickup. Minutes later, her phone pinged on Interstate 40. Then, nothing. This was the night that changed everything. It was the beginning of a mystery that would stretch for years. A case that began with one ordinary evening, ended with a void that investigators could not explain. The silence of those hours left questions that no one in Cookeville could escape. And as the town waited, hoping for answers, the case moved from urgent to unresolved. The disappearance of Emily Grace Walker became the puzzle that would define Cookeville law enforcement for nearly a decade. In the next part, we will follow how investigators handled those first critical weeks, the suspects they identified, and why every lead ended in frustration. On the morning of September 15, 2011, police returned to Jefferson A, the small diner where Emily Grace Walker had finished her shift the night before. By then, her family had reported her missing. Her bed in the dorm had not been used, and her car was no longer in the lot. Officers cordoned off the parking area, treating it as the starting point of a potential crime scene. The lot was carefully arranged. Investigators looked for blood, broken glass, signs of a struggle, anything that might indicate what happened to Emily after she walked out. They found nothing. No dropped phone, no purse, no torn clothing. Nothing to suggest she had been attacked where she was last seen. What stood out most was what wasn't there: her car. That absence gave detectives their first two theories. Either Emily had left willingly with someone she knew, or she had been forced to leave by someone who had control of her vehicle. Both possibilities were troubling. Cameras were checked immediately. The diner had its own security system, but it only covered the entrance and the cash register inside. It confirmed that Emily signed out, picked up her things, and walked out the door at exactly 11:02 p.m. The system did not extend to the back lot. Police canvassed nearby businesses for additional footage. A small convenience store down the road had an exterior camera that captured passing vehicles. In the recording from that night, investigators spotted the faint image of a truck, possibly green, possibly a Ford pickup, moving past the area not long after Emily left work. The quality was poor, and the vehicle could not be identified with certainty. The license plate was unreadable. Still, it was something, and for days that blurry truck became the focal point of the investigation. Witness accounts were inconsistent. One driver passed, other people questioned gave contradictory statements. A pair of customers who had left the diner around the same time thought they saw a woman walking toward the street, but couldn't confirm it was Emily. A third person insisted they heard raised voices near the parking lot around 11:30, but no other witness could corroborate that detail. With every interview, detectives found themselves chasing leads that didn't align. As standard procedure, investigators turned their attention to those closest to Emily. Family members, her boyfriend, her roommate, and her close friends were questioned. Nothing in their accounts suggested conflict or instability. No evidence pointed to a fight, a plan to leave, or a hidden part of her life. Her parents insisted she had been looking forward to exams and the weekend ahead. Her roommate said she had her books stacked for class. She wasn't going anywhere. With family and friends providing no suspects, attention shifted to her workplace. Coworkers were interviewed at length. Managers described her as dependable and cheerful, never late, never careless. One colleague said, "She clocked out like always, smiled, and said she'd see us tomorrow." No one reported any arguments with customers or unusual incidents during her last shift. That left one obvious category: strangers who may have crossed her path. Police considered whether Emily had been targeted by someone hanging around the diner. Officers checked records for registered sex offenders in the area and questioned several individuals known to frequent the neighborhood. None of those interviews led to evidence. The name that surfaced quickly was James "Jimmy" Dalton. At 25, Dalton was a mechanic in town. He was known to police for a minor assault charge a few years earlier. He also had a reputation for drinking and getting into fights. Witnesses reported seeing him near the diner on the night Emily vanished. With little else to go on, detectives zeroed in on him. Dalton was questioned extensively. He admitted he had been near the area that evening, but denied contact with Emily. He insisted he spent most of the night at a gas station a few miles away. At first, his alibi seemed thin. Then, surveillance footage from the gas station placed him inside at 11:20 p.m., the critical window when Emily was last seen near the pickup. Multiple customers confirmed his presence there. That timeline made it nearly impossible for him to have been involved. Reluctantly, police cleared him as a suspect. The investigation lost its only solid lead. Detectives next tried to work backward from Emily's phone records. They confirmed the last ping on Interstate 40 between 11:30 and 11:45 p.m. No calls had been made after she left the diner. The signal went dead after that window. No additional data could be extracted. The Ford pickup remained the biggest question mark. Officers cross-referenced every green Ford truck registered in Putnam County. Dozens of names surfaced. Owners were interviewed, vehicles were checked, alibis were confirmed. None lined up with the timeline. Investigators were left staring. The community response was overwhelming. Volunteers organized nightly search parties. Groups combed fields, wooded areas, and back roads. Flyers covered telephone poles, gas pumps, and store windows. Cars lined the shoulders of the interstate as people searched ditches and creek beds. But for all the effort, no new evidence was found. As weeks passed, the atmosphere shifted. What began as collective determination slowly turned to unease. Rumors circulated about possible suspects, about police mishandling evidence, about secret leads that were being ignored. None of it was true, but the absence of results fueled speculation. Cookeville, usually a quiet college town, began to feel tense. Inside the department, detectives faced a familiar problem in missing person cases. Too few leads, too many uncertainties. Every fact they had pointed to dead ends. The parking lot showed no struggle. The cameras gave no usable images. The witness accounts contradicted each other. The prime suspect had an alibi. The vehicle could not be identified. Investigators admitted privately that the case had stalled. One officer was quoted in a local paper saying, "We're working around the clock, but the trail is thin. We need someone out there who saw something to come forward." Appeals for information continued, but tips slowed. By the end of that first month, the investigation had reached a frustrating standstill. The initial sweep of suspects yielded nothing. The truck remained a mystery. Dalton was cleared. The phone records added no clarity. Every piece of evidence confirmed that Emily left work and walked to the lot. After that, she was gone. The town was left with fear and doubt. Parents warned their daughters not to walk alone at night. Students at Tennessee Tech traveled in pairs. The idea that someone could vanish in such an ordinary setting after a normal shift in a familiar lot shook the community deeply. Local media began to question whether Cookeville police had the resources or experience to handle a case of this magnitude. Editorials asked why more state investigators had not been called in. Some accused authorities of moving too slowly in the first critical hours. About a month after Emily Grace Walker disappeared, a group of volunteers organized yet another search. They focused on the area near Center Hill Lake, a sprawling body of water just outside Cookeville. On a cool afternoon, while moving through brush near the shoreline, one of the searchers spotted something caught in a tangle of branches. It was a red jacket. The item was quickly recognized. Emily had been wearing a red jacket on the night she vanished. The discovery sent a jolt through everyone involved. After weeks of uncertainty, they finally had a tangible piece of evidence. Volunteers called the police immediately, and the jacket was collected and secured for forensic testing. At the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Laboratory, analysts began a detailed examination. They confirmed that the jacket belonged to Emily. Fibers, hair, and other trace materials were collected. Most important, technicians detected a DNA profile. Alongside Emily's own genetic material was a second set belonging to an unknown male. For investigators, it was the first major lead in the case. The news spread quickly. Families, friends, and neighbors who had been waiting for any progress felt a surge of hope. Local news ran headlines claiming the red jacket could hold the key to unlocking the mystery. The police tip line lit up with calls. People reported seeing unfamiliar trucks, suspicious men, and unusual activity near the lake. Each call was logged and checked, but no tip produced anything concrete. The DNA was processed and entered into CODIS, the national database used to match suspects in criminal cases. But when the results came back, there was nothing. The profile did not match any known offender. It belonged to someone who had never been arrested, never been recorded, at least not in any database accessible to law enforcement. The lead that had seemed so promising stalled almost immediately. Investigators were left with the same questions they had faced before. How did the jacket end up by the water? Had it been discarded intentionally to mislead the search? Was it lost during a struggle? Or had it fallen during the transportation? As the search dragged on without further discoveries, frustration took hold. Family members expressed their anguish in front of cameras. Emily's parents said they were grateful for the work of volunteers, but pleaded for stronger results. Her sister appeared at a vigil and told reporters, "We thought this would finally lead us to her. Now it feels like we're back at the beginning." The town of Cookeville felt the same weight. For weeks, the red jacket had given people something to believe in. But as days passed with no resolution, the feeling of helplessness returned. Conversations shifted from when Emily would be found to whether she ever would be. The media, once energized by the discovery, began to describe the investigation with a new phrase: a cold case in the making. Detectives continued to review the DNA sample, but technology at the time could not do what it can today. In 2011, genetic genealogy databases were not widely available to law enforcement. The unknown male profile sat in storage, waiting for a match that never came. Theories about the jacket became part of local discussion. Some said the killer had planted it deliberately to divert attention to the lake. Others believed it was dropped accidentally during the movement of Emily's body. A few argued the jacket might have been placed there much later, after the initial search had passed. Each theory had merit, but none could be proved. In the months that followed, the investigation grew colder. Detectives returned to the lake multiple times, hoping new eyes or new conditions might reveal something missed, but nothing surfaced. Volunteers grew exhausted. Search efforts slowed. Flyers with Emily's face began to fade on windows and telephone poles. The hope that had surged with the discovery of the jacket drained away. For Emily's family, the jacket was both comfort and torment. It confirmed she had been near the lake at some point. It carried her DNA, proof that she had worn it. But it also showed the presence of another, an unidentified man whose name they still didn't know. It was the closest thing to an answer they had, and yet it deepened the mystery. By late 2011, the Walker case officially shifted into the category. From that point, the story entered a long period of silence. For years, the jacket sat in an evidence locker, preserved but unanswered. The DNA sample remained unmatched. The searches stopped. The headlines faded. What began with promise ended in another dead end. Emily's disappearance slipped further from the spotlight, remembered mainly at annual vigils or when her family spoke publicly to keep her name alive. To many, the red jacket represented unfinished business, a clue that seemed to hold the truth but stubbornly refused to reveal it. This was the first major breakthrough. But it was also the moment when the community realized the case would not be solved quickly. Hope rose, then fell, leaving behind only frustration. And so the mystery of Emily Grace Walker moved into the long, dark years of waiting. In the next part, we will look at that decade of silence, how her family refused to let her name disappear, and how the case survived in memory while official leads went cold. After the discovery of the red jacket near Center Hill Lake, investigators thought they finally had something solid. But weeks turned into months, and no progress followed. The DNA profile extracted from the jacket remained unmatched in every database. No suspect emerged. No new witnesses came forward. The file slowed, then stalled, until it was officially categorized as a cold case. For the Walker family, that label felt unbearable. To them, Emily was not a cold case. She was their daughter, their sister. They refused to let her name fade. Almost immediately, they launched their own campaign to keep attention on the investigation. They contacted local newspapers, spoke on television, and asked the public to stay alert. They printed posters with Emily's face and posted them along highways, at gas stations, and outside Tennessee Tech. Her picture became a constant reminder in Cookeville, a young woman gone without answers. Her mother often repeated one line to reporters: "We will not stop until we know the truth." That sentence became a rallying cry. Friends joined in the effort, helping place missing person boards near the college campus, and despite these efforts, the investigation itself remained frozen. The Cookeville Police Department and the Cold Case Unit revisited the file more than once. Detectives reviewed interviews, searched through evidence logs, and checked any possible updates in forensic tools. Some physical samples were sent back to laboratories as new testing methods became available. Yet the results were always the same. No identification. No breakthrough. One investigator admitted in an interview, "We have pieces, but nothing connects them into a clear picture." That summed up the frustration. The DNA on the jacket, the vague witness statements, the blurry pickup truck image, none of it added up to a suspect that could be brought into court. The community felt the weight of the stalemate. At first, neighbors organized large search efforts, combing through wooded areas, riversides, and abandoned lots. But after years of disappointment, those efforts slowed. Candlelight vigils continued, but the energy was different. People still cared, but many no longer believed Emily would be found alive. A quiet fear spread in town. If the person who took Emily was never caught, was he still out there? Was he walking among them? Living in the same neighborhoods? That unease made people cautious, but also more withdrawn. Parents reminded their daughters to travel in groups. Students avoided walking alone at night. But with no arrest, no confirmed suspect, the fear never had a clear target. As time went on, the media also shifted. The first year after Emily's disappearance, reporters followed every new lead. The second year, coverage shrank. By the third, the case appeared only during anniversaries. Headlines now called it one of the county's most persistent cold cases. For the Walker family, the pain was constant. Each September 14th, the vigils grew more symbolic. They were no longer about finding Emily immediately, but about ensuring her name stayed alive. For her sister, who was just 15 when Emily vanished, the years of waiting shaped her teenage life. By adulthood, she became one of the strongest voices demanding justice for Emily. The Cookeville community kept a measure of support alive. Emily Grace Walker's case became one of the longest-running unsolved disappearances in Putnam County. The Cold Case Unit logged it as open but inactive. For the family, it was never inactive. Every lead, no matter how small, was pursued. Every year they asked again, was there a neighbor who remembered something? Was there a driver who passed by the parking lot that night and had stayed silent? But the phone rarely rang, and tips rarely went anywhere. The years in the dark felt endless. Hope existed, but it was thin, carried by the family's persistence and the community's sympathy. For outsiders, the case seemed frozen in time. For those closest, it was a wound that never closed. Nearly 10 years had passed, and the picture of Emily still hung on posters, now faded and weather-worn. Each candlelight vigil looked almost the same. Her mother's words, her sister's tears, neighbors holding candles. But behind the ritual was an unspoken fear that this would be the way the case remained forever. The file labeled Emily Grace Walker sat among stacks of other cold cases, a story half told, waiting for answers. Everyone feared it would remain there indefinitely, lost to the passage of time. But change was coming. Forensic science was evolving, moving beyond the limits of traditional DNA comparison. What once was just a profile in CODIS would soon become a key in genetic genealogy. Investigators didn't know it yet, but technology was about to give them a tool that could finally break the silence. For almost a decade, Emily's case lived in darkness. But in the end, it was science that brought back the light. In the next part, we'll see how new forensic technology transformed a single trace of DNA into a trail that led straight to the man who had hidden in plain sight for years. Nearly a decade had passed since Emily Grace Walker vanished. For years, the file sat in the cold case unit marked Unsolved, marked stagnant. But science was changing, and with it, the future of cases like Emily's. Investigators made the decision to send the DNA from her red jacket to a specialized forensic lab. This wasn't the same kind of testing used back in 2011. This was next-generation sequencing, coupled with genetic genealogy. Traditional CODIS searches could only match against convicted offenders in a law enforcement database. This new method went further. It compared unknown DNA to consumer genealogy databases, looking for distant relatives. It could find matches that traditional systems had no chance of identifying. The results came back. For the first time, there was movement. Analysts identified several distant relatives of the unknown male whose DNA had been found on Emily's jacket. These were not suspects, but cousins, extended family members. Using genealogical mapping, experts began to build family trees, tracing lines across Tennessee and beyond. Slowly, the branches narrowed, leading toward a handful of living men who could not be excluded. Pulled his old phone records. They examined cell tower data from September 14, 2011. Emily's phone had last pinged along Interstate 40 around 11:30 p.m. Ross's phone showed activity in the same sector, the same window of time. The overlap was chilling. After years of nothing, a timeline finally began to form. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery wasn't technical. It was personal. Records and photographs showed that Ross had volunteered in the search for Emily. He stood shoulder to shoulder with her family, handed out flyers, and walked the woods looking for clues. On camera, he appeared as a supportive neighbor. To the Walkers, he was one of many who had offered help. To detectives, this detail now stood out as a calculated mask. Still, suspicion was not enough. Investigators needed proof that the DNA from the jacket belonged to Ross. They put him under quiet surveillance. Teams followed him around town, watching his movements, waiting for an opportunity to collect discarded items. Eventually, they retrieved objects he had thrown away: cups, utensils, trash that carried his DNA. The samples went back to the lab. The comparison was exact. The DNA from Ross matched the unknown male profile on Emily's red jacket. After nearly 10 years, the forensic silence was broken. But investigators didn't stop there. They reviewed his history. They confirmed he had once owned a green Ford pickup, sold years after Emily's disappearance. They tracked his old addresses, comparing them to search zones used in 2011. They studied his work records, his associates, his movements. Piece by piece, the puzzle closed in around him. The evidence was now layered: a direct DNA match, overlapping cell tower records, ownership of the vehicle described by a witness, and the damning fact that he had embedded himself in the search for Emily. For the Walker family, the call from detectives came as both relief and shock. After years of unanswered questions, they were told a suspect had been identified. The man was not a stranger from another state, not an unknown drifter. He was someone they had likely passed in town, someone who had once pretended. For nearly a decade, the case of Emily Grace Walker had been frozen, a story of frustration and stalled leads. That changed the moment science moved beyond the limits of CODIS. Genetic genealogy turned a scrap of fabric into a key, and that key unlocked the name David Ross. The case that had once been nothing but dead ends now had momentum. Investigators who had once stood before cameras with no answers could finally speak with certainty. The unknown male profile was no longer unknown. This revelation did not bring closure, not yet, but it was the turning point. After years in the dark, the investigation finally had a clear target, a man whose mask of normalcy was beginning to fall. The silence had lasted almost 10 years. The breakthrough shattered it. And now, the focus shifted from science to justice. The DNA had spoken. The family had their answer. The community had their suspect. The next chapter would be decisive: surveillance, arrest, and the trial that would finally reveal the truth of what happened on that September night in 2011. In the next part, we follow the police as they close in on David Ross, the arrest that shocked a town, and the trial that exposed every detail of the crime that had haunted Cookeville for nearly a decade. The summer of 2021 brought an ending few in Cookeville thought they would ever see. After 10 long years, the cold case unit and Putnam County deputies moved in on a quiet home at the edge of town. Inside lived David Ross, a man most neighbors described as ordinary, helpful, even friendly. That morning, officers surrounded the house, weapons drawn, waiting for the signal. Within minutes, Ross was in handcuffs, led down the front steps. A neighbor, watching from across the street, shook her head and whispered, "He was just a normal guy." Nobody ever thought this. The sheriff's office made the announcement quickly. They had DNA evidence, cell phone records, and physical objects tying Ross directly to the disappearance of 19-year-old Emily Grace Walker. For the first time in a decade, the case that haunted Cookeville had a name attached to it. The evidence was not one piece, but a chain, linked together carefully. The first link was the red jacket found near Center Hill Lake years earlier. Forensic scientists had pulled a male DNA profile from it, but the technology in 2011 had offered no clear match. By 2020, that had changed. Next-generation sequencing allowed investigators to compare the sample with genetic genealogy databases. The profile connected to distant relatives in Tennessee. Analysts built out a family tree, narrowing the list until one man stood out: David Ross. Detectives then turned to digital records. Archived data from cell towers placed Ross's phone near Interstate 40 the night Emily vanished. The timestamp matched almost exactly with the final ping from Emily's own device. That overlap was impossible to ignore. When investigators searched Ross's home in 2021, they seized several items. The most damning was a coil of nylon rope, identical in make to the fragment recovered near Emily's remains when search teams finally located her in 2020. The fibers matched under lab testing. Alongside it were personal effects, receipts, tools, even notebooks that suggested Ross had kept quiet knowledge of the night Emily disappeared. And then there were the words of people who once knew him. The Walker family faced cameras outside the courthouse. Emily's mother spoke briefly. Her voice shook, but her words were sharp.
"We waited 10 years for this day. We will not stop until justice is done." By the fall of 2021, the trial began. The courtroom was crowded. Every seat was filled with townspeople, reporters, and family members who had lived the case for a decade. The prosecution opened with a simple timeline. Emily left work at 11 p.m. on September 14, 2011. She was seen beside a green Ford pickup. Her phone sent its final signal along I-40. David Ross owned a green Ford pickup at that time. His phone connected to the same tower at the same moment, and his DNA was on her jacket. Expert witnesses testified one after another. A forensic scientist explained the genetic genealogy match and the steps taken to confirm it. A digital analyst demonstrated how Ross's phone records lined up with Emily's. A fiber expert held up samples of the nylon rope, pointing out the microscopic similarities between the piece found near Emily's remains and the rope seized from Ross's shed. The defense pushed back hard. Ross's attorney argued that DNA could have been transferred indirectly. Maybe he handled the jacket in a public place, maybe contact was innocent. But the state's expert dismissed that argument. "This was a direct deposit of biological material," he said firmly. "The probability of random transfer explaining this result is effectively zero." The defense also tried to argue the timeline was circumstantial. But a witness took the stand and recalled seeing Ross near the Jefferson A parking lot the night Emily vanished. "I saw him close to the restaurant," the man testified. "I didn't think much of it at the time, but now it makes sense." The days turned into weeks, and the trial played out detail by detail. Photos of evidence were displayed. Recordings of interviews were replayed. Every moment built pressure in the courtroom. When it came time for the verdict, the tension was heavy. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. Their decision was unanimous. David Ross was guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping. The judge pronounced. Still, the importance of the verdict could not be denied. A cold case that had haunted a town for a decade had been solved through persistence, science, and the voices of those who never gave up. The Walker family had waited years to hear the words guilty. Now they had them. This was the turning point, but it was not the end. After the sentencing, attention turned to what would come next. The family would finally be able to bring Emily home for burial. The community would face the task of healing, and law enforcement would draw lessons for future investigations. The trial of David Ross showed one thing clearly. Even in the darkest cases, the truth can surface. Technology, determination, and patience had converged to reveal what happened that September night. The verdict closed one of the longest and most painful cases in Putnam County. For the Walker family, it meant something they had waited nearly a decade to do. Finally, bring Emily home. After the sentencing, her remains were released to the family. A funeral was held in Cookeville, attended by hundreds. Friends, classmates, neighbors, even strangers who had joined searches years earlier all came together. The atmosphere was heavy, but it was not only sorrow. There was a quiet relief. After 10 years of questions, the family could lay their daughter to rest.
Emily's father stood in front of the crowd and said, "We no longer have to wonder." Now, Emily is at peace. The town itself moved quickly to honor her memory. 1 month after the trial, a community vigil was organized at the Jefferson A parking lot, the very place where Emily was last seen alive. Hundreds of candles lit up the night. Students, professors, and search volunteers shared their memories. Some admitted they still struggled to process the truth. One woman said, "It's hard to believe. He was with us, searching, helping. And all this time, it was him." The vigil was more than remembrance. It was a public vow that Emily Grace Walker would not be forgotten. At Tennessee Tech University, where Emily had been studying nursing, law enforcement also faced hard truths. The Putnam County Sheriff's Office released a full after-action report. In it, investigators admitted their early missteps: limited use of surveillance, failure to reconcile witness contradictions, and the inability to exploit cell phone records in 2011. They committed to reforms: preservation and periodic retesting of DNA, mandatory reviews of old cases using new technology, and expanded partnerships with genealogical databases. Officers received new training on how to combine traditional investigation with forensic genealogy. These measures became part of Tennessee's broader effort to improve how cold cases are handled. The lessons from Emily's disappearance reached beyond Cookeville. Families of other missing persons pointed to the case as proof that persistence pays off. Media outlets highlighted the role of technology. Experts explained how next-generation sequencing could pull usable profiles from degraded samples, profiles that were useless a decade earlier. The story reinforced a clear message: no piece of evidence should ever be considered too old to matter. For the Walker family, the trial's conclusion was both closure and a reminder of what was lost. They had answers, but no return of the years lived in uncertainty. For the community, the revelation that the killer had once stood among them at search parties left deep scars. Trust had been broken, but the town found a measure of healing through shared remembrance and reform. On the evening of September 14th, the anniversary of Emily's disappearance, hundreds gathered once again. Candles lined the sidewalks. A photograph of Emily, framed by flowers, was placed on a small wooden stand. People approached quietly, some touching the frame, others whispering a prayer. In front of the picture stood a small sign that read simply, "Never forgotten." The case of Emily Grace Walker is remembered for what it cost: a decade of uncertainty, a family's heartbreak, a community's shaken trust. But it is also remembered for what it proved: that justice, though delayed, can